Hello and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to return to the Wild West and look at the side that we didn't look at last time. Namely, hey, weren't there a lot of Native Americans living out on this land? How did they feel about all of these Americans moving onto their territory and, finding gold and building railroads and driving cattle? Well, as you probably guess, they were not super thrilled by it, and so we get another round of conflict with Native Americans. So your basic objectives are here. Hopefully by the end of this, you can answer these with some detail. And let's dive into yet another story of Native American wars and conflict over land. So the causes of this conflict are, the same thing that causes all the conflicts between the United States and Native American tribes. The United States passes laws to significantly speed up/facilitate westward settlement without taking into account the fact that they had previously offered that land to Native Americans. And even when they do take that into account, when new resources are developed, or when it turns out that like a steel plow means we can farm Western Kansas now, all of a sudden we decide that, hey, that land that we told you could have forever, maybe not. Obviously, moving out west and the government opening up this territory means that there's going to be significant conflicts between the United States and the Native American groups, and so it's all the same thing. And in general, the government previously had made promises to Native Americans, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs was supposed to be sort of the watchdog that was going to prevent abuses to Native Americans. But in practice, just like everything else in the Gilded Age, they were massively corrupt. They pocketed most of the money that they were supposed to send out to Native Americans, and far from being advocates for Native Americans, they ended up more trying to convince them to sell increasing land to Europeans. So yeah, not ideal. In the end, it starts for the same reason that all of these things start. There's a Native Americans have a treaty. In this example, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which creates a massive reservation that basically says, hey, this area in the middle of these 5 states, we don't think is going to be super useful to us in the future, so you can have it forever. And the Native Americans agree, and then peace is maintained for a time. But pretty quickly, Western settlement and especially travelers moving into some of these areas start crossing this Native American territory. Some Native Americans get irritated as the settlers, steal things from Native Americans and don't respect their tribal rights. The Native Americans fight back, and then the U.S. Army comes in to try to solve the problem, quote unquote. Then, of course, they negotiate down and cut down the amount of land that the Native Americans have in future treaties. And the cycle, and then peace is maintained for, a dozen years, and then the cycle repeats itself yet again. One of the big facets that led to this round of Native American wars was the end of the Civil War. During the Civil War, a number of Native American groups started to push back and to gain some of their autonomy. We're looking specifically at the Sioux people up in South Dakota, started pushing back on westward settlement, and the Apache people in the Southwest. Because the United States was busy trying to kill half of the other United States, the Native Americans were relatively successful for a time at pushing back on westward settlement. But of course, when the war ends, now all of a sudden we're building railroads and we're trying to again push westward settlement, and we freed up a whole bunch of troops who can now go and fight against these Native American tribes. And so the short-term gains that a lot of Native peoples got during the Civil War were very quickly reversed in the years thereafter, as the newly demobilized Union and Confederate armies, many or some of the soldiers signed up to go fight in these quote-unquote Indian wars. Of course, state governments also got involved. This was from a magazine or a newspaper in Minnesota, offering a $200 bounty for every dead Native American. And so we go all the way back to Ben Franklin's settlement of the whole Paxton Boys thing, and we get some really horrific policies designed to mostly terrorize Native Americans and convince them to move out of these areas. So there's basically 3 wars that we're going to use to symbolize / stand in for all of the rest of the wars. The Apache Wars, went from all the way from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo all the way through 1886. Originally, it was Native American chiefs like Cochise here, who would use the Mexican border to somewhat stymie attempts to capture him. And so they would cross the border on both sides whenever the heat got too much on either side. And so by using the Mexican border, the Apaches were able to elude capture for, well, generations. But eventually, American policy pushed leaders like Geronimo into smaller and smaller areas, and they were able to limit their food supply, preventing them from doing the type of moving that they were able to do previously. And so by strangling out the Apaches economically, they were eventually able to cut back on their influence. And although Geronimo is the most famous Apache leader, was able to, again, fight an ongoing guerrilla war for a decade because the territory in the Southwest is very difficult, eventually he was forced to surrender, and the Apache were pacified by 1886. Then you've got the Cheyenne War in western Kansas and eastern Colorado. This was on account of a substantial treaty, again in 1851 as part of Fort Laramie. So the Fort Laramie Treaty gave the Cheyenne people this sort of large land reserves in between Colorado and Kansas. But unfortunately, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush sent tons of settlers onto the Native American lands, which led to conflict between Native Americans and settlers. So new treaties were negotiated with some Native American groups leaving out others, and the Native American groups who did not accede to the treaties ended up turning and trying to resist. Chief Black Kettle is the most famous of these sort of Cheyenne warriors pushing back against and raiding settlers, settlement camps, and boom towns, sort of in western Kansas and eastern Colorado. And eventually, John Chivington was dispatched in order to deal with him, and he may have been a little bit too zealous about going to take out Native Americans, because he perpetrated one of the worst massacres in Native American or U.S. government relations. The Sand Creek Massacre was a group of Cheyenne people who were moving under the protection of the U.S. Army. It was mostly women and children, and Chivington's troops massacred them all, killing every single one of them. After this brutal massacre, even Chief Black Kettle gave up, and the Cheyenne people went back to their reservations to try to live whatever life they could. Finally, you have the Lakota War up in the Dakotas. The Lakota War was, again, same issue. The Great Sioux Reservation was getting chopped up in order to facilitate specifically the Black Hills Gold Rush. And so a couple of Native American chiefs, including most famously Crazy Horse here, raised a group of Sioux warriors to fight back against this encroachment. Crazy Horse and his followers are famous because they were able to defeat the U.S. cavalry led by George Armstrong Custer. This is Custer's famous last stand at the Little Bighorn. And so although Custer and all of his troops were killed, eventually larger detachments of the U.S. Army came. Crazy Horse himself was killed by another Native American who disagreed with his policy, and the Lakota coalition fell apart, and they were defeated. And so all of these Native American wars sort of have the same cause and the same outcome. And eventually the US government decided that they needed a more cohesive policy to try to prevent these conflicts in the future. So they focused on a policy of exterminating the bison. They figured that if they could get rid of the North American bison, the Native Americans would no longer have the reason to travel around and would be content going back to their reservations and purely taking up agriculture and other pursuits that would use far less land. So buffalo hunters, including most famously Buffalo Bill Cody, were dispatched out to the west in order to get rid of the bison. And here's a picture of a massive pile of bison skulls. Over the span of about 5 years, the North American bison was hunted almost to extinction. So there's your North American bison population. And it was relatively successful because, especially for Native Americans like the Lakota, if there's no bison herds to follow, you really don't have much option except to go back to the reservation and try to eke out a living on the terrible land you've been given, and the sort of the stipends that get through the corrupt layers of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Finally, it was decided that these reservations need to be abolished altogether, and the US government passed the Dawes Sobriety Act, which cut down the amount of land that Native Americans were given by about 80% by parceling out land to individual families. So, by giving land to individual families as opposed to tribes as a whole, they were able to open up millions of acres of Western land to settlement, leading to, among other things, the Oklahoma Land Rush. Some Native American chiefs protested against this. Most famously, Wovoka here started something called the Ghost Dance Movement. Wovoka was a religious leader who tried to create another sense of pan-Native Americanness, think Tecumseh and the Prophet. And so the Tecumseh to Wovoka's prophet was a guy named Sitting Bull. Here's your Sitting Bull. And they joined together in order to try to perform this elaborate ritual. Wovoka taught that if the Native Americans could perform the ghost dance perfectly, that the white people would go away and the buffalo and their dead ancestors would come back. This, of course, just like Tecumseh and the Prophet, freaked out the US government, and they dispatched the army to capture Sitting Bull. And at a place called Wounded Knee, the survivors of the ghost dancers were massacred and were dispersed. So, with the dispersal and the end of the ghost dance movement, this was the end of organized Native American resistance in the West, and there were no more Native American wars, and Native Americans are unfortunately going to vanish from our narrative until the New Deal, when they get their reservations back, and then eventually the Civil Rights Movement, where Native Americans start to again push to recapture their tribal heritage. But we're both 50 and 100 years from that happening. And so for now, with the Dawes Act, the Native American tribes have been broken, and the narrative of constant treaties and then treaties broken and then more land being taken away formally ends with the Dawes Act. And of course, today, Native Americans do still have some reservations, but we'll get back to this when FDR recreates them again in the 1930s. So hopefully you can answer these questions, and we'll move on to go back to our sort of urban centers and talk about the specific big businesses that were benefiting from all this land that we had just taken from Native Americans.